So a police officer pulled a driver aside and asked for his license and his registration. "What's wrong, officer?" the driver asked. "I didn't go through any red lights and I certainly wasn't speeding." "No, you weren't," said the officer, "but I saw you waving your fist as you swerved around that lady that cut you off. And I further observed your flushed and angry face as you shouted at that driver that was driving in the left-hand lane. And I also saw how you blasted your horn when the traffic came to a stop suddenly near a bridge. Is that a crime, officer?" "No, but when I saw the 'Jesus loves you and so do I' bumper sticker on your car, I figured this car must have been stolen." So, hypocrisy, right? I mean, we all know it when we see it. Someone claims one set of principles and then they live out of some sort of logic that seems like it's completely in conflict with all of those stated values that they've articulated. Yet, I want to know who among us does not sometimes fall prey to making choices despite all of our best reasoned intentions, choices that play out in ways, well, they just don't align with those deeply held core beliefs. See, it's complicated. It is complicated living a life that has complete integrity between our faith and our actions. It is doubly complicated when we start to think on the level of communities and entire peoples. So we have to prioritize. We have to take into account both our intentions and the impact of our actions. And we have to somehow manage to look beyond ourselves to the needs of all of the people around us, including the people who don't really have a voice. So it's no wonder that we get stuck. We sometimes just get paralyzed when we're trying to make all of those choices that are involved in some of the basic tasks of daily living, when we're trying to think on this level of how we live, keeping together our faith and our action. I mean, a simple trip to the grocery store, for example. It involves all sorts of moral quandaries like organic, is it locally grown, is it plant-based? Is it fair trade? Is it sustainable? Is it low packaging, free range? And well, that's not even taking into account all of those morally neutral quandaries, like the vital decisions around fat and sugar and nutritional content. So if you're me, after making all of those difficult and thorny choices just to fill up my grocery cart, I find that I get to that cash register and I have left my paper bag or left my reusable bags in the car. So there's the check person and he's asking me paper or plastic. I'm thinking to myself, okay, paper, plastic, can I get away with running out to the car? Then I look behind me, 3 people in line behind me. So there is no way that I'm going to risk the glares involved in that little maneuver. So I could, pay a few more dollars or $2 for one of the reusable ones that they helpfully sell for us right there behind the counter. But only this past week, I read that in fact, a reusable organic cotton grocery bag has to use 20,000 times, 20,000, before it makes up for the amount of water and resources that go into its manufacturing. Now, if you like me, I've got 25 bags at least already sitting in the trunk of my car, not in the grocery store with me, right? So I say paper as I kind of swallow down that really good dose of guilt. And then I solemnly vow that next time I'm going to show up with my grocery bags in hand. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not suggesting that we give up on reusable grocery bags. I'm only pointing out that it's not easy. It is not easy always living in a way that is fully consistent with our faith and our values. I mean, we try our best, but we also continue to be imperfect. We're human, and despite all of those best intentions, perfect righteousness, it always just stays right out there, just beyond our grasp. So you can see why groups of people have chosen over time to codify their practices into things like laws and doctrine and customs. They decide that forming habits, instead of having to make all of those difficult decisions every time over and over again, is helpful to us. I mean, we get worn out thinking it all through every time, and routine. I mean, if I could just get that habit down of bringing in my grocery bags, think how much better I would do. It's always been the case that habits help us on this front, so long as we don't lose track of the underlying purposes for all of those rituals that we've devised. Jesus, I think, would have a lot of compassion for our plight. We meet Jesus today as he's drawn into a complex debate over purity practices with some of the local members of the Pharisees, a Jewish sect, who are there, talking to Jesus, asking questions, and they brought their scholars of Torah law along with them. Now, we've met these guys in the Gospels before. We meet them so often, in fact, that it is easy for us to just sort of write them off as the bad guys, right? Even worse, we might assume that Jesus's critiques of the social justice consequences of the Pharisees' hyper-pious ways represent some sort of blanket dismissal of Judaism and its purity code practices. It's when I read passages like today's gospel that I try to always check in with my Jewish annotated New Testament. It gives me some helpful insights from Jewish biblical scholars and theologians and all of the historians about what's really going on in these kinds of verbal sparring contests between Jesus and his frequent rivals, the Pharisees. Today, they seem to be arguing about hand washing practices before eating. Now, I know this makes absolutely no sense to our 21st century pandemic mindset right now. I mean, is Jesus really saying that washing our hands before eating is somehow problematic? Is he saying that his disciples don't wash their hands before they eat? I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm thinking, oh, that's kind of gross. I don't want to go eat with them. Well, my Jewish commentary points out that they are not talking about germs here. They're talking about how to maintain a type of spiritual purity that relies upon avoiding foods that haven't been prepared by Jews in accordance with all of the kosher practices. These practices, they're laid out in the book of Leviticus, and so it would be easy for us to assume that all Jews in Jesus's time agreed on what to do and why they were doing it. But my commentary tells me that this, in fact, was not so. Apparently, there was all sorts of varieties of interpretations and practices among the Jewish people in Jesus's time, just like there are today. The most mainstream practices prioritize ritual purity and preparation for certain important religious ceremonies, things like the Sabbath or Passover. But it was somewhat laxer in terms of day-to-day life. It's kind of like how Catholics used to have to fast before taking communion on Sunday mornings and all day Friday, but they could eat what they wanted pretty much the rest of the week. Now, this passage actually implies that Jesus and his disciples seem to follow this more mainstream approach. But the Pharisees, they liked to take things to the extreme. Their interpretation was that Jews ought to do everything possible to avoid even the tiniest bit of ritual impurity pretty much all of the time. Anything less than this, they said, was risking the whole nation's fulfillment of the covenant obligation. Now, these guys were serious about this stuff. And in the case of hand washing, their worry was that, well, you just never know if you might have accidentally touched something while you were out and about in town that wasn't kosher, or that a non-Jew might have also touched. And on top of that, there was no silverware back then. People, they ate with their hands. So you can at least see their concern, right? I mean, one could accidentally ingest all kinds of things. Hence, the Pharisees had these enthusiastic and elaborate practices for hand washing before meals. It might have involved things like special sourcing of the water, where you get your soap, how you prepare the wash basin. I mean, they really get into this stuff. And they want to go the extra mile. So we're wondering, no harm, no foul, let them just go about their business. So why is Jesus so upset? Why is Jesus calling them hypocrites? The problem is that the Pharisees want everyone else to follow this extra pious approach too. And they're claiming that if people don't, then they're going to be branded sinners and outcasts. Now, never mind that for many Jewish peasants in their day, it was hard to scrape together whatever meager food they could manage to secure for their families to eat on a daily basis. And for many women, they had to walk miles just to haul enough water for their households to get by. Might have had to go even further if it was making sure that you've got the right kind of water. Jesus has a counter argument, and it's a little bit more layered than we're even getting in the reading that we heard this morning, because if you look at all those verse numbers that are listed for today, we're skipping all sorts of bits and pieces of this entire exchange. It's in one of those parts that we skip that Jesus starts to show how circular some of this reasoning can become as people try to navigate this deep and long-held accumulation of rules and customs that people have decided are necessary to guarantee this kind of hyper-religious level of purity and practice. Jesus demonstrates how we could, in fact, get to the absurd conclusion that one owes absolutely nothing to your mother and father. One could do that by arguing solely from a first principle that we, in fact, owe everything to God. Now, that's true. We do owe everything to God. But God also told us to honor our parents, so you can see how the problem gets made. One of the other things that we miss out on is Jesus making a pretty crass comment about sewage to really drive his point home. Now, as I thought it'd be the ultimate proof that Jesus was truly God-made man. Because, if he loves a good poop joke, well, how more human could that be? You know what? I digress. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jesus is pointing out that we have to think about why we do what we do. And then we have to start to prioritize the stuff that matters most. There is no point in keeping to this kind of vigilant ritual purity practice day in and day out if doing so means that we end up excommunicating anyone who's too poor to meet this kind of high bar. Protecting the vulnerable, like widows and orphans, that is what is central to God's commandment, says Jesus. All this elaborate hand washing stuff, that's a human tradition. So don't miss the forest for the trees, to use some modern language on that. Jesus is choosing cleanliness of heart over cleanliness of custom. And Jesus is challenging all of us to continually reassess all of those codified practices that humans have devised to deal with the complexities of actually living out our faith, and to look at them just to make sure that they still in fact serve God's way too. Oh, and while you're at it, Jesus wants to make sure that you do not overlook all of the obvious evil that people get up to, like murder and abuse and theft and greed, just because you're so wrapped up in all of your pious rituals. Now, you would think that this is straightforward, but remember all of those times across history that our religious practices have in fact needed reforming because they had started to do harm to people. They weren't serving the ways that God had taught us. It's like Thomas Cranmer wrote in the preface to the first book of Common Prayer way back in 1549. There was never a thing by the writ of man so well devised or so sure established, which in continuance of time hath not been corrected. Cranmer was one of the architects of the English Reformation. It's the Reformation that birthed the Anglican tradition that we all are heirs of sitting here today. Cranmer wanted to reshape the medieval church in a way that would help all of us to avoid those pitfalls that Jesus is warning us about. He wants us to make sure that we don't revere practices more than we honor the dignity of every human being. Now, Cranmer's approach was to aim for simplicity. He wanted us to stick to the core tenets articulated by Jesus in Scripture, things like love God, love your neighbor as yourself. You know the list, it's not really that long. I mean, Jesus was also trying to make it simple for us. And then Cranmer says we need to avoid having too many rules and make the necessary few that we do have to have easy to understand. Then finally, his genius put it all in one book so that anyone can lay their hands on it and make sure that it's written in a language that we all understand. Now, everything else that Cranmer has to say, he tells us is traditions, human traditions. And those are the things that can vary by place to place, as well as change over time. It's been 550 something years since Cranmer did his reboot of the English church. How do you think we're doing? What do you think? A lot of us have been Episcopalians for a long time. I mean, what kinds of practices might we cling to today that get in the way of seeking and serving Christ in all people? That's the question that Cranmer wants us to keep asking ourselves day in and day out. And it's a question that Jesus is also pushing us to examine. Or, if you want the simple approach, we can check out our reading from James, because he succinctly says, be doers of the word. The Epistle to James is a book in the Bible that was mostly written as a circular that went to a new generation of churches that were far flung. They were spread out widely across the Roman Empire, and they existed mostly in the late 1st or early 2nd century. There was no way at that point in time that a single set of practices handed down from the founders, the first generations after Jesus, could give them all of the answers that they were facing in that time in those places as they tried to live into their Christian faith. I mean, there were all sorts of varied, complex, and very multicultural metropolises that these churches were located in at this time, in places like North Africa, Asia Minor, and maybe even Gaul and Spain. Instead, this letter articulates a pragmatic, action-oriented approach that calls for a combination of spiritual discipline and getting on with helping the poor. I love this letter. I love how it reminds us that the Word of God, it lives right there inside of each of us. It's not just something that we find on the pages of a book. It's in our hearts. It's like this gift that goes with us wherever we might be as we seek to live out our faith. Today's passage urges Christians to stop arguing and to avoid getting stuck in empty religious practices. It's saying, get over your moral paralysis and get to work. I found the Message translation, it makes that last line in the passage really hard-hitting. Listen to this. Real religion, it says, the kind that passes muster before God the Father is this: reach out to the homeless and the loveless in their plight and guard against corruption from the godless world. So, hypocrisy, we do all know it when we see it. But Jesus calls upon us to know why we do what we do, and then to do it for the right reasons, for God's reasons. It is complicated living a life that has complete integrity between our faith and our actions. But we will also continue to be imperfect. So, next time you face the choice, paper or plastic, do not let those choices and the rituals that we've used to sort them through paralyze us. Instead, use every gift that God has given us to figure out what the gospel calls us to do in this time, in this place, and then do it.